in between these names, I'll only need 2 columns, a first name and a last name. So I'm going to split the contents of cell A2, and I'll include a comma, and now I'll put in my delimiter. It's a space, so I need to put that between quotes. I'll close out my function, hit the Enter key, and the contents of the name have been brought to the first and second columns. I can copy this column, paste it down, and now I have a great split of everybody's names. So not to worry if you're exporting data and nothing matches up. You can fix all these problems programmatically using functions that already exist in Google Sheets. Let's go over some row and column manipulations you can use in Google Sheets. I can easily add a row by right-clicking inside the row number and selecting Insert one above or one below. I'll hit Ctrl or Command Z on my keyboard to undo that, and I can do the same thing by right-clicking on a column header. I'm given the option to insert a row or column to the left or the right of the currently selected column. There's also a very easy way to quickly insert multiple rows or columns. I can click and drag with my mouse inside the row number. It's going to select as many rows as I drag, and when I right-click inside the row number, this time I'm given the option to insert the currently selected amount of rows above or below. If I needed to add 4 new employees, I can simply select 4 rows and get 4 blank ones. Columns work the same way. I can click and drag and select multiple columns, right-click inside the column header and choose Insert 2 to the left or 2 to the right. Something else that you'll need to do with rows and columns is move them around. Google Sheets makes dragging and dropping easy. Select the row, and if I click inside the row number, the cursor changes to a grabbing icon. When that changes, I can then slide the data around. The thick gray line inside the row will tell me where it's going to move the row. When I let go with my mouse, Carlos will be moved from position 9 to position 5. I can also do this with multiple rows. I'll use the same methodology to select multiple rows. I'll grab the cursor. I'll click the cursor again so it changes to a grabbing icon. And now I'll move it around. When I let go, Jessica is now the top option instead of Kimberly. I can also do this with columns. I'll click to select a column, click to change to the grab icon, and now I can drag it and rearrange it. I've now swapped the email and the name columns. The last thing I want to show you is how to size columns to fit the data. I'm going to smush these columns a little bit so the data is a little bit hard to read. We can resize columns just like I did by sliding over the header. However, if I hover my mouse so that the arrow changes to a right arrow, I can double-click on the mouse, and it will automatically resize the column to the maximum size that it needs to be to fit all the data. I'll do that one more time in column B. I'll hover my mouse over the column header so that the cursor changes to a right arrow, double-click, and the column is instantly resized perfectly. I can still change them manually, of course. I can click and drag and resize the column as I want, but even if it's too large, I can still use this trick. If I double-click, it will simply make the column header smaller to fit the data. Conditional formatting allows you to change the format of certain cells based on condition, such as the value in the cell itself. You can change the font properties of a certain cell, row, or column, even the color of the cell itself. This is useful for being able to quickly glance at a sheet to see patterns of data, trouble spots, good news, or even faulty or flawed data. This last column contains the last time a hotel guest stayed with us at the Landon Hotel. I want to be able to glance at the sheet and quickly spot which guests haven't stayed with us in quite a while. We can do that with conditional formatting. I'll get started by clicking the H column header to select the entire column. Now I'll click Format at the top of the screen and choose Conditional Formatting. It's going to open up the conditional formatting pane on the right-hand side. I need to check and make sure that the correct range is being applied to. In this case, it's the entire column of H. And here I can click the 2 up and down arrows to the right of Cell is not empty. Here's where I choose my condition. I have a lot of choices. I can change the way the cell looks based if it's empty, not empty, if it contains certain text. I can also check date values. I can check regular operators to see if it's greater than a certain value, less than, equal to, even if it's in between. Finally, I can choose a custom formula, and I'll show you how to do that later. But for now, I'm going to focus on these date values. I can choose whether the date is a certain date, if it's before a certain date, or after a certain date. In this case, I'm going to choose date is before. If I choose date is before, I get a new dropdown. I can choose from today, tomorrow, yesterday, in the past week, month, even year. In this case, however, I'm going to choose exact date. I want to put in my own value. So I'll put in the time that I want to check when the guest has last visited. January 1st, 2015. Here's where I can choose the formatting style. By default, it will put a shaded green background on the cell, but I can change other things. For example, I can make it yellow, red, even custom format to change the font face, such as make it bold-faced or change the color of it. If I've made all the changes I want to make, I can click Done, and I can also add a new rule if I want. I can stack conditional formatting rules. It's going to run through them in order, and I'm also given the opportunity to rearrange them or delete them by clicking on the trash can. In this case, I can close out of the pane by clicking the X in the top right-hand side. Here I can see that it's already highlighted and shaded the cells of those guests that haven't visited before January 1st, 2015. Let's do this again. Let's suppose I want to take these guests and email them with a special offer to hope that they can come back and stay with us again. Now we have an email column, but I want to make sure that every single email address is populated, and I want to very quickly be able to see if it's not. Once again, I'm going to highlight column D, click Format, Conditional Formatting, and this time I'm going to format the cells if it's empty. If it doesn't contain a value, I want to change the way it looks. I'll change it from the default. I want to give it a red background so I can see very quickly if it's blank. I'll click the blue Done button, close out of the pane, and now let me delete some of these values so we can see what happens. As I delete the values, you can see that the background is already turning red. Now I can very quickly glance and see who's missing an email address. Let's do this one more time with a custom formula. After reaching out to these guests, I want to put in some follow-up text to see how it went. I'll put in a new column called Follow-up. I want to be able to put in the text of our conversation, so I can be sure that enough detail has been put into this column. I want to make sure that I have at least 50 characters worth of data. I can do that by using a custom formula. I'll select my entire column, go into the conditional formatting pane. In the Format Cells area, I'm going to scroll all the way to the bottom and choose Custom Formula Is. Here is where I can put in a particular value or a formula. In this case, I'm going to use the len function. This tests the length of the entire string in the cell. So I'll start by typing my formula. We always start it with an equal sign. The column is I, so I want to make sure that every cell in the column I has at least 50 characters worth of data. If it contains less than 50 characters, then make it green. I'll click Done, close out of my pane, and now my employees will know when they've added enough data into this follow-up cell because the background will change to white. Now they know they can move on. You can make sure the integrity of your data stays nice and clean by using cell validation. You can validate every cell to make sure the formatting fits certain criteria, such as data, text strings, or even restricting values to a drop-down list of choices. Google Sheets makes it incredibly easy to add validation. Let's add some validation to this email column to make sure a valid email address is entered. I'll start by clicking the column header in D to select the entire column. From here, click Data, and all the way on the bottom, click Validation. First, I need to check and make sure the correct cell range is covered. In this case, it's the entire column of D. That's what I want. And the next step is to choose the criteria. If I click the drop-down next to List from a Range, here's all of the validation I can do. I'll go over range values and a list of items later, but you can also validate based on number, text, date, even a custom formula that you create. I'm going to click Text for now. Once I click Text, I get a further drop-down in which I can pick more choices. I can validate and make sure text contains certain criteria or doesn't. I can make sure it equals a value. These two are incredibly powerful. I don't have to do any special coding by myself. Google Sheets comes with this already built in. So all I have to do is click Is Valid Email. I can also click Is Valid URL if it's for a web address. But I'll click Is Valid Email, and now I have to decide what to do when invalid data, that is, not a proper email address format, is entered into a cell. I can either show a warning or I can outright reject the contents. In this case, I'll put Show Warning. I'll click the blue Save button, and I've added validation. Let's see what happens when text that isn't a valid email address is entered. You can see that it allows me to enter the data because I told it to, but flag it with a warning. Here on the top right-hand side of the cell, you can see that it has a little red triangle. If I click inside the cell, it's telling me that the cell contents violate its validation rule. As soon as I change it back to an email address, it will be okay again. Let's do that again. I'm going to add a new column. You can even use validation to add a drop-down list that users can select in the cell. I'm going to click I to select the entire column. I'll choose Data, Validation, and in the criteria, I'm going to choose List of Items. I can enter the items separated by comma. These items are going to be the only thing that users can choose to populate that cell with. Always, sometimes, and never. In this case, I'm going to select Reject Input if somebody puts the wrong choice in here. I can also choose the appearance. It defaults to me showing an in-cell button to show list. It's going to put a drop-down icon in the cell itself. If I don't want that icon to show up, I can simply leave this unchecked. But for now, I'll leave it checked so you can see what it looks like. Click the blue Save button, and here you can see the little drop-down beside each cell in this column. If I click the drop-down, here's my choices, always, sometimes, or never. I don't need to click that drop-down. I can start typing, hit the Tab key, and my choice will be populated. Now, because I put in the rule that it's going to reject any data that doesn't fit this profile, if I put something in and hit the Enter key, I'm going to get a rejection. It's not going to allow me to put in anything that violates the validation rules. It even says what the choices I can use are. There's one more thing I want to show you. You can create a range of values and then use that range as the choice. This is useful if you want to build on existing things that are already in your sheet without having to know what they are first. Here's a column that contains the credit card types that users can choose. I'm going to create a validation list of choices based on these values. I'm going to first create a range. I'll do that by selecting a large sampling of this data. Once I've selected everything, I'll click Data, and then I'll select Named Ranges. I'm going to give this range a name. I'll call it Credit Card Type. I'll click the blue Done button. I'll close out of this pane, and now let's add a new column. For this example, I'm going to make another credit card type column. I'll select the entire column, choose Data, Validation, and this time the criteria is going to be a list from a range. I'll type in the range that we just created, credit card type. I'll keep the In Cell button to show the list of values, click the Save button, and now when I click the drop-down button in the credit card type cell, I can see a list of choices that we just created in that named range. So you can create validation rules and drop-down lists based on data if you don't even know what that data is. Play around with validation. It's incredibly powerful and it will help keep all your data under control. You can add an image to a spreadsheet. Select Insert from the top menu, choose Image, drag to find your image here, browse Google Drive, or you can also upload an image. I'll select one from Google Drive and click the blue Select button. It's going to add it to your spreadsheet. You can move it around. Now this one's quite large, so I'll also resize it. It's interesting to note that it doesn't get in the way of being able to edit cells. You can still edit cell contents behind the image. However, it's not very easy to work with. With Google Sheets, you can use the image function to add images to individual cells. I'm going to erase this larger image. Let's first find an image to add to a cell. I'll click on our Landon Hotel website. Here's an image. I'll right-click on it and choose Copy Image Address. The image function takes a web address for an image. I'll go back to my cell, and we're going to start off a formula by using the equal sign. I'm going to put in the image function in open parentheses. The web address of the image needs to be in quotes, so I'll start by adding open quotes, and then I'll paste in the URL that I just copied. I'll close out the quotes, close out the parentheses, hit the Enter key on my keyboard, and we now have a nice image inside the cell. There's some more parameters that we can change with this image. By default, it's going to scale the image to fit the cell, but we can override this. I'll put a comma after the image in the close quotes, and I'm going to change the parameter by adding a 2. This is going to change to have the image be stretched to fit the entire cell. In fact, if I resize the cell, it's still going to stretch the image accordingly. I can change this to a third option. This is going to show the image and preserve it in its original size. It's hard to see the image now, but if I click and expand the row, here we can see the image. The last option is to be able to set a custom size. This is option 4, and it requires 2 more parameters, so I'm going to add a comma. It requires additionally knowing the custom height and width in pixels that you want to add. I can change the size, and that's what I get. The default option, without any parameters, can also be looked at by adding a 1 instead. That's going to give us that first option, which is scaling the image to fit the cell. Now remember, I made the cell wider, so that's why it looks like this. If I resize the row, it's going to adjust the size of the picture accordingly. So those are 2 ways that you can add images to your spreadsheet. You can add an image using the Insert menu, choosing Image, and adding your image so that you can slide it around anywhere in your sheet. Or you can also use the Image function and put an image actually inside a particular cell. You can format a cell using a combination of changing the size of the column, changing the text wrapper, and inserting line breaks into the cell itself. Here's a cell that's quite large and it's going off of the cell itself. So the very first thing I'm going to do is change the text wrapping of the entire column. I'll select the column, choose Format from the top menu, hover my mouse over text wrapping and choose Wrap. This is going to have it wrap the size of the cell, no matter how wide the column is. I can adjust it according to how wide I want it. It would still be a little more easy to read, however, if I could add paragraph marks using line breaks. I can do that by adding one simple command on my keyboard. I'm going to double-click to start editing the cell itself, hold the Control key down on my keyboard, and hit the Enter key at the same time. It's going to add a line break. Now when I hit the Enter key, it preserves that line break, and it acts as a new paragraph in the cell itself. I can even do that while I'm typing directly inside the cell. I'll hit Control-Enter, and I'm on a new line. I'll hit the Enter key again, and now you can see that it's much easier to read because it has line breaks. So once again,